knowing about DARVO, being able to spot it and tell yourself, and even plan, expecting it and knowing so that you're not caught off guard by it, can help you, the target, manage the situation.
When you look across the landscape of wrongdoing and you see the ways in which people kind of, I don't know, have almost like a choreographed way of responding when they get in trouble in public, it can really feel as if like they're all sort of like trading tactics. Well, I was lucky enough to do a fellowship at Stanford in a year between my time as a correspondent at Al Jazeera and when I was working at NBC News. And I made a friend there, one of the other fellows, who told me about an acronym that she had come up with and had studied and quantified, and it was called DARVO. And DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse, Victim, and Offender. It is a way that she basically looks at, the ways everybody from Clarence Thomas to Brett Kavanaugh to President Trump managed to kind of wriggle their way out of an accusation and reverse it, flip it back on the accuser. She really opened my eyes to an amazing array of problems around this. And she's gone on to do some really incredible work. A lot of this work comes from a place of incredible personal bravery on her part, which we'll get into in this conversation as well. But when I knew I was going to do this podcast, I knew I wanted to have her on. And so this is, I think, for me, it's a really near and dear topic. And I hope that you learn as much from her as I have. Dr. Jennifer Freyd, Professor Jennifer Freyd, it's great to have you here, but I'm going to call you Jennifer in this conversation because we know each other, right? We were fellows at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. That's where we met. We were like walking buddies. We were lunch buddies. So I'm going to call you Jennifer through this, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So I'm sort of workshopping a kind of introductory question, and I'm asking you to sort of help me with it. Let me know if this sort of lands for you. But right, the theme of the rip current, this publication I'm doing in this podcast series, is this idea, right? A rip current for swimmers it's an invisible force, very hard to spot from the beach. And even when you're caught in it, you don't know you're in it often. And very often your instincts in trying to get out of it are wrong. You swim against it and exhaust yourself and get carried further out to sea. So it's this sort of, for me, it's this symbolism, right, of these larger kind of hidden forces in the world. So if you were to describe a rip current that you think people should know about, what is the biggest, most dangerous rip current, in your experience, and how did you first come to sort of understand it? Again, this is loose. I'm workshopping this. You know what I mean? I don't have it tight yet, but help me think about that one.
Yeah. I mean, that's a hard question to answer what it's like the most.
The most is not right? So let's see. Let's do it together. But what's one that you have specialized in your life? Yeah, in your career and encountered.
Well, one thing that I notice is that people can really fight with their own feelings of attachment, love, caring for other people or forces that have hurt them and maybe are continuing to hurt them. And that fight is usually counterproductive because the feelings come from really the way we're constructed, which is to grow attachments and care for people or groups that we're spending a lot of time with, that in some way provide us with resources and at least at some point in time care for us. And it doesn't really work to tell yourself how not to feel. And it can just be a big energy sink to be having that kind of internal battle with oneself. In contrast, if you're feeling those positive feelings towards a person or a group that you know are actually hurting you and not good for you, instead of fighting the feelings, you can take action to set up boundaries and figure out what to do with your emotions in other ways. And it's just probably it's like swimming sideways out of the rip current because it's not fighting some big force that you really don't have a lot of ability to fight just through rational thought.
Yeah. So you when we first met in this fellowship, you sort of opened my eyes to this whole concept, well, two concepts, right? A concept of institutional betrayal, and then the institute that you now run, uh, that's named for the idea of institutional courage. And this is sort of what I'm thinking about in the that's what you're saying reminds me of is these concepts, the idea that, oh, I have this connection, this bond with this institution that I work for, or I'm a student at, or whatever the thing is. And oh my gosh, they've betrayed me entirely. How do I square that with my instincts? Like you say, this sort of tribal understanding that I'm held in the bosom of this group. How is it possible that they've done this? You know, maybe we should just sort of let's do some biography if we can, just to sort of give people a sense of it, because I think your experience professionally and personally, to the extent you're willing to talk about it, is really I mean, for me, helped me understand just how deep your work goes. I don't know. Where do you want to start with that? Can we do a little bit of that?
Yeah, I think it might make sense to talk about a concept I developed even before institutional betrayal that really inspired institutional betrayal. And that concept is betrayal trauma. And I started to work on uh, it's what I've called betrayal trauma theory um, in the early 1990s, partly in response to my own experiences, for which I did not have a very good explanation. And at the time, I was a tenured professor of psychology who knew a lot about memory and quite a number of things. But what I did not understand at that time, because nothing I had learned in school had prepared me to understand, was that one can forget some terrible betrayal for some period of time and then remember it.
Mhm.
And so I really set out to try to understand that experience. And I knew I wasn't at all alone in having that experience, but it was my own encounter with it that caught my attention. And the theory I developed, betrayal trauma theory, has at its core a concept I call betrayal blindness. And that's not seeing a betrayal in its fullness. Sometimes not seeing means not seeing at all. Sometimes not seeing means seeing a little bit, but not in its fullness. Something going on that is really hurtful and damaging.
Mhm.
So, for example, a child being abused by a parent who doesn't fully see it, or a partner in a marriage being abused by their spouse and not fully seeing it. And I developed a theory to explain that. And betrayal blindness, according to the theory, comes from an absolute need to remain attached to individuals in those cases, and later I extended it to institutions that are providing necessary resources.
Mhm.
That attachment is what helps keep the resources coming. And it's very dangerous to separate oneself. And I think we see this all the time. I think we see this in the world right now. People's
Mhm.
great difficulty in separating themselves out from organizations that they know are doing hurtful things to them and other people. It's a
Mhm.
very basic need to keep in a position where resources continue to come in. When we're in a very empowered situation where we don't depend on somebody who's mistreating us, then we typically are very aware of betrayal.
Sure, and
And it's
easy, and it's easy to take a stand. You're not dependent
yeah,
on that person. That's right.
right. And so we fight or we withdraw. It's, the source of major conflicts all the time and the end of relationships. But when there's dependence, think what happens. If you fight or withdraw, your situation might just get a whole lot worse when you don't have, or you think you don't have other options. I think a level of complexity here is people sometimes misjudge the options that they do have. But say a child, they don't have other options, particularly.
Mhm.
What are they going to do if they reject a caregiver? It's not going to help them in any way and might cause,
Mm-hmm.
cause them to die.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody's in a job situation and their employer's mistreating them and they're fully aware of the betrayal and they react with the natural kind of responses of withdrawal or confrontation, they may lose that job. And depending on their skills and the employment situation, that may be the only job that they are able to have or that they think they can have. So the consequences of seeing betrayal can be very great.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, this is, relates to the thing I was saying at the beginning about people not fighting their attachment because the attachment really springs from the way we're wired up. It's part of our evolutionary history that we have this strong positive response, typically the emotion of love, to caregivers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, when a kid's been abused by a parent, they not always, but very typically will continue to love that parent. And
Mm-hmm.
then they can fight it in themselves, they can hate themselves, but that's really not counterproductive. Protecting themselves from an abusive parent, that's productive. But
Mm-hmm.
trying to stop having those positive emotions. And similarly, if you're working in a company that you've devoted your career to and, really formed an attachment to, or maybe it's your school or your government, and then they're betraying you, it's not helpful to be fighting your feelings about it. What is helpful is to be taking protective action and figuring out what actually you can do in that situation.
When for you in learning about betrayal blindness and without dragging you into talking anything you don't want to talk about, your own experience of sort of coming out of that fog,
Yeah.
what is that like? What is it like when one sort of sees the plot accurately for the first time, in some cases years after the
For
betrayal that
most
you're talking
people,
about?
it's a crisis. It's a
Mm,
usually a stark crisis to go from some degree of fog, as you call it, of not seeing something, and then seeing it in its fullness. And that can uh, be as if it has just happened to you in a way. It
hmm,
can be it
hmm,
can be just a very profound crisis. Adding on the layer too, people often then blame themselves for having not seen it, for having stayed in the situation, and et cetera. So, um, it's a very profound experience. And
hmm,
for a lot of people, I think what motivates it is that by not seeing it, it's hard to stop ongoing mistreatment, whether it's
hmm,
to oneself or to other people. So that's the big cost in not seeing it, is it's hard to stop it if you don't see it, and it's hard to prevent other kinds of betrayal from other people because you've kind of turned off your your detection mechanisms to
right,
not see it. So
right.
it puts you in a really vulnerable position, even if it might keep you alive, because
Hmm,
seeing it's so dangerous. But at some point in life, you may find yourself with enough distance and resources that in some sense it is now safe to see it.
hmm,
And it's very painful, but it is not going to risk your life to see it. So,
hmm,
but often what motivates it is actually to protect other people.
hmm,
So, in my own case, I remembered certain things from my childhood, and I'm sure that a major factor was the vulnerability of my own very young children, and
hmm,
how my seeing it would allow me to be much more protective of them and keep them
hmm,
safe.
hmm. So because you were at that time a young mother, something in your wiring connected to those instincts around safety and your children, and it
Right.
somehow gave you what your brain needed to see through, like you say, the to lose the blindness that you had had until
Yes.
then.
Yeah, it kind
Hmm.
of changes the trade-off, the equation. Like,
Right.
what's the
I.
cost of blindness versus the cost of knowledge? And
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah, and I think, for many of us, protecting our children is such a high priority that we'll go through a lot of suffering in order to protect children. And certainly that was
Yeah.
my experience.
It's sort of the first time in a lot of people's lives where they can actually consciously sense that their parents are less important to them than this new family unit they've built. I've had this experience, right? Where you suddenly, there's this, I just turned 50, and for my 50th birthday, I got myself a tattoo with my kids' initials on them. And that's the first time in my life I've ever considered putting anybody's name on me, including my parents, because they're the penultimate, they're the ultimate responsibility. And so it eclipsed my relationship. I still love my parents, and I'm fortunate to have a nice relationship with them, but it eclipsed my relationship with them. It changes your perspective. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So, at that time in the 90s, when you were starting to create that theory and think about that, there was this fashion in, God help me, mainstream media, what I do, what I did for years for a living, of of pushing back against the idea that one could have remembered something from years prior, and right, recovered memories and all of this sort of stuff. Is there, people listening to this may think, oh, I know about that. Yeah, people, therapists were tricking their patients into thinking things had happened that never happened. You're an expert in this. You spent a career thinking about this. Is that a thing?
Memory's not perfect. It's not perfect in either the sense that you're always accurate, and in some sense, you're never fully accurate. It's always digested through your nervous system. And it's not perfect that it's not always available. And we all have this experience in the most mundane ways. Where are my car keys? Did I turn the oven on or off? I can't remember. And then remembering, but being wrong.
Mm.
Oh, I parked over there, but in fact, parked somewhere different. So errors in accuracy and failures in what we might call memory persistence are just common everyday ways that the memory system can break down. And fortunately, most of the time, we remember what we want to remember reasonably accurately. What is important for people to know is these two aspects of memory are correlated with one another. So you can think something happened to you and be wrong, but you're not more likely to be wrong or right depending on if you forgot it for a while. They're
Hmm.
just two different aspects of memory. And in the early 90s, these two things were completely conflated with each other. So people would talk about false memories versus recovered memories. And that's just a false dichotomy.
Hmm.
You can have memories that are inaccurate, whether you have the experience of always remembering them or not. And, that's just the nature of human memory. I think that there was a huge amount of political narrative and rhetoric that was propelling that it was really trending. It was this fashion to reject the accounts of survivors of child abuse
Hmm.
and say that they were false.
Hmm.
And it followed a period before that of increasing awareness from survivors and other people about how high the rates of child abuse were.
Hmm.
So it was a kind of predictable backlash. And it wasn't the only backlash going on. There were groups that were formed. There was one called Vocal Victims of Child Abuse Laws that was formed by parents and others who were saying they'd been unfairly
Hmm.
accused by protective services and that they were the victims of the situation. There's just a lot of backlash in the early 90s. And then it lined up with things like backlash against feminism, because then it became an issue of these, you know, hysterical women with these